Good morning. Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Pursuant to notice, the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology meets today to consider the following measures. H.R. 2484, the Harmful Algae Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act of 2011. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6D and House Rule 11-2H4, the Chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on any question or of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas or nays are ordered. We'll make sure that everyone has enough time to get here, as we do not want Mr. Noggeberger involved in another police chase. It's the Chair's intention to provide at least 10 minutes notice prior to the commencement of roll votes. Let's proceed with the markup, beginning with opening statements. I will begin. I want to welcome everyone here today for the markup of H.R. 2484, 2484, the Harmful Algae Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Acts of 2011. Harmful algae blooms, or HABs, are a significant summertime problem that affects rivers, lakes, and tidal areas in almost every state. In addition to damaging ecosystems, harmful algae negatively impacts local economies that depend on healthy water for fishing, recreation, and tourism. The bill before us today attacks this problem at its core by strengthening the science necessary to understand HABs and advancing technological solutions to better prevent and respond to outbreaks of when they occur. I want to commend Energy and Environment Subcommittee Chairman Harris on his effort to craft focused bipartisan legislation to reauthorize this small but important program. The product before us is a good bill that incorporates input from members on both sides of the aisle as well as the administration. I urge members to support it. I yield back the balance of my time. I'll now recognize Mrs. Johnson for 5 minutes to present her opening remarks, and as much as she is the leader of the Democratic faction here, we won't hold her to exactly 5 minutes, but she's been pretty good at keeping with 5 minutes. We hope she'll continue to do that, but we're going to try to hold all of us, and I'll hold myself to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think I can do that. Today we are marking up Mr. Harris's amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 2484, the Harmful Algae Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act of 2011. And I want to commend both you, Chairman Hall, and Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Harris, for taking on this important issue with what could have been a good bipartisan bill. In fact, with the exception of a few new activities and an approach to funding that I will discuss a little bit later, it is nearly the same as the former E&E Subcommittee Chairman Brian Beard's bill that passed the House last Congress. However, in this Congress, the committee is supposed to be working within a new set of Republican protocols that's based on the markups we've had to date appear to be increasingly difficult for the majority to actually follow those protocols themselves. The outcome is more than just some procedural wrangling in committee. It's also resulting in bad policy that in reality harms the research activities that the sponsors profess to support. We've seen the same pattern play out all too often this Congress. A bill is brought up that highlights the importance of a particular area of research and then fails to authorize the resources the agencies need to continue the work that they're already doing. And then on top of that, it further burdens them with new unfunded mandates. I'm afraid that today's markup is continuing that trend. The issue before us is an important one: the need for continued research and public awareness of the increasing frequency and duration of harmful algae blooms and hypoxia, which are affecting more of our coastlines and inland waters than ever before. NOAA and the HAB's research community have made great strides in advancing our understanding of harmful algae and hypoxia, Even under already severe budgetary constraints, they have managed to achieve scientific discoveries that improve many of our coastal and inland water management practices and have advanced our forecasting and early warning capabilities to minimize economic impacts and protect human health. Given that, it is beyond me why we would not, at a minimum, sustain authorizations for these research activities at their current levels, despite acknowledging the risk of HABs and the progress this research has made. This bill makes even further cuts to already underfunded research activities, actually cutting back authorizations lower than 2008 spending levels. And I must ask, how does this help? I cannot support such an approach to dealing with a problem that affects much of our country, including the Gulf Coast and the Florida coast and Great Lakes, the Chesapeake Bay, and indeed the continued safety of our drinking water nationwide. There will be constructive amendments offered today to correct the shortcomings of the bill before us today by giving members a clear choice: either increase the funding to pay the new mandates in the bill or cut back on the mandates if we are unwilling to pay for them. That is just common sense and good fiscal policy. And as much as I would regret it, unless we can adopt some of these amendments of Mr. Miller's and others, I don't see how I can support it. If we're going to say that we care about this research and that we care enough about the impacts of the HABs to take action, then we actually have to invest in a way that will move this research forward and not further damage the capabilities of the agencies. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of time.
Gentlelady yields back. Without objection, all members' opening statements will be placed in the record at this point. We'll now consider H.R. 2484, the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act of 2011. I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Harris, to describe his bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this markup today on a very important piece of legislation. Mr. Chairman, as you know, this is the season for algal blooms in most parts of the country. In fact, an article in the Washington Post just this past week outlines the difficulties we face with algal blooms in dead zones, and the announcement this week that in the Chesapeake Bay the dead zone is likely to be larger this year than it has in past years. H.R. 2484, the bill we're considering today, the Harmful Algal Blooms and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act of 2011, is the product of an effort involving the administration, majority and minority members, and stakeholder and affected communities. The objective of this reauthorization bill is to provide greater coordination to the federal government's harmful algae and hypoxia-related research, monitoring, prevention, and response efforts. Generally, the bill does this through updated program guidance that adds budget and reporting requirements and an enhanced focus on accelerating technological solutions to reduce the harmful impacts of these outbreaks. I will now briefly summarize the specific provisions of the bill. The version passed out of subcommittee is almost the same as what was introduced in the House. One amendment was offered by Mr. McNerney to include international cooperation and information sharing, and it was agreed to by unanimous consent by the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. H.R. 2484 reauthorizes the Harmful Algal Blooms and Hypoxia Research and Control Act of 1998, better known as HBARCA. The bill restates language in the underlying statute that created the Interagency Task Force. However, it now requires budget coordination for the activities in the bill. This coordination will assist with budgetary planning and raise the visibility of the research programs within the agencies that participate in the task force. H.R. 2484 also directs the task force to maintain the program established by the 2004 reauthorization of HBARCA and provides the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere, who is also the administrator of NOAA, with direction and specificity to carry out the program's activities. As we heard at the hearing on June 1st, there is a need for technologies to deal with HAB outbreaks in addition to looking for solutions to prevent or minimize them in the first place. H.R. 2484 directs NOAA and the EPA to maintain a focus on technology research and development for freshwater and marine harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. It also requires NOAA and the EPA to develop protocols to determine when technologies are ready to move from lab testing to field testing, to maintain an electronic information clearinghouse to aid with the dissemination of information, and to develop a mechanism to ensure quality and cost-effective toxin standards for comparative research. H.R. 2484 directs NOAA to oversee the development of a comprehensive research plan and action strategy and identify the appropriate regions to be highlighted by such a plan. The action strategy outlines the specific activities to be carried out by the task force, a timeline for such activities, and the programmatic roles of each federal agency on the task force. The research plan must also identify research, activities, and technologies needed to detect, predict, monitor, prevent, control, and mitigate harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. H.R. 2484 further directs the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force headed by EPA to update the assessment plan, required under the current statute, and subsequently update the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan 2008. The updated action plan must take into account available information and examine several potential solutions to reduce the hypoxic zone based on the information garnered in the updated assessment. H.R. 2484 also requires NOAA to assess and report on the dead zone in the Chesapeake Bay and develop a plan for reducing, mitigating, and controlling it. H.R. 2484 provides NOAA with an authorization of $18 million for each fiscal year from 2012 to 2015, a level just slightly below 2010 spending levels. It also authorizes funding for the Administrator of EPA for each fiscal year from 2012 to 2015 to carry out the activities in the bill. Lastly, I'd like to note that the authorization for the underlying statute expired in 2010. In the current fiscal environment, authorizations that have lapsed will be more likely to lose funding. This makes it even more imperative that we pass this authorization as soon as possible. I yield back the balance of my time.
All right, the author of the bill yields back his time. Does anyone else care to comment or be recognized on the bill? All right. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that members proceed with amendments in the order listed on the rosters. And it is so, Arthur. The bill is open for amendments. First amendment on the roster is an amendment on the nature of a substitute offered by Dr. Harris. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment number 371, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2484 offered by Mr. Harris of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, it's so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and of course the amendment is at the desk. The amendment in the nature of a substitute includes a few changes to H.R. 2484. The amendment removes the word established from the definitions of the program and the task force, as both of these had already been established in the underlying statute. It changes the freshwater program to require that the administrator of the EPA does not duplicate activities already ongoing and instead focuses on new approaches to addressing freshwater harmful algal blooms. Furthermore, the amendment includes a check on EPA by requiring the administrator to submit a report on all the activities undertaken. The amendment changes the report that H.R. 2484 requires for the Undersecretary or the Administrator of NOAA to prepare and transmit to Congress in Section 5 of the bill. It now directs the Undersecretary through the task force to prepare such a report. It also removes the requirement that the report describe the implementation of the action strategy. NOAA has indicated that it feels that such an implementation, which would require checking on the actions of other federal agencies, would be beyond its mission authority. The amendment in the nature of a substitute also includes an additional requirement in the development of the research plan for the Chesapeake Bay Dead Zone to ensure that the plan does not duplicate activities conducted by other federal or state agencies. Finally, the authorization of appropriations language in that the amendment changes H.R. 2484 to provide the administrator with $2.7 million for each of the fiscal years 2012 through 2015. This is possible due to the savings gained through the NOAA authorization of $18 million. Last but not least, The amendment includes a non-duplication requirement that the administrator ensure that activities carried out under the bill do not duplicate research and development activities related to harmful algal blooms or hypoxia conducted by other federal agencies, states, tribes, and non-governmental organizations. I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. I support the amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If not, are there any amendments to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland? Second amendment on the roster is an amendment I'm offering. It's amendment number 373 at the desk. Clerk, report the amendment.
Amendment number 373, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2484 offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. It's so ordered. This amendment will simply provide clarity in the bill when it says Undersecretary. It's simply referring to the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere. As there should be no need for further discussion, we can have further discussion, but on this amendment, the vote occurs on the amendment number 373 to the amendment. All those favors say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Now, for the second degree amendment offered to the Harris, are there any other amendments? Anyone?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Over here.
Mr. Sarbanes seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr.
Chair
Chairman.
recognizes you for 5 minutes.
I appreciate it. I have an amendment to Congressman Harris's amendment in the nature of a substitute. It's at the desk.
Clerk, report the amendment.
Amendment number 015, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2484 offered by Mr. Sarbanes of Maryland.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. It's so ordered. Before I recognize the gentleman, I want to let the gentleman know that we're going to accept the amendment. So if he would agree to submit his statement for the record, we'll move directly to voting on his amendment.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Could I have just 30 seconds?
Yes, sir. You
on it?
have 5 minutes, 30 seconds to 5 minutes.
I appreciate that. Well, it is an important bill, the underlying bill. And as Mr. Harris indicated a moment ago, there's just recently been new attention to the dead zone in the Chesapeake Bay. What my amendment would do is ask the task force to consider potential beneficial uses. Well, there are two things to address these algal blooms. On the one hand, trying to deal with the issue on the front end by looking at what sorts of grasses like switchgrass and other kind of biofuel that you could plant that would capture some of these nutrients before they get into the bay, so you can reduce the amount of algal bloom that results as a result of the nutrients coming in. So it asks to do research on that question, and it would also have them look at the potential to harvest some of these algal blooms once they occur, and whether those can be turned into biofuel. Obviously, we don't want it to happen in the first place, but if it does, and if those algal blooms exist, then we ought to be looking at potential technologies and other opportunities to harvest that in a way that can be used in a beneficial way. And I think while there's some issues with that, it deserves some consideration. So I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, the committee's willingness to accept this amendment. I think it's a positive addition to the bill, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. Hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the second degree amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
What purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
I'd like to speak on the amendment from Ms. Edwards, who has not arrived yet. And the amendment is
Without objection,
this amendment.
let's let the clerk call the amendment first.
Amendment number 015, amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2484, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland.
All right. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. It's so ordered. Before I recognize the gentlelady, I want to let her know we're going to accept her amendment, so if she would agree to submit her statement for the record, we'll move directly to voting on her amendment. Is the gentlelady agreeable?
I am agreeable. I accept that, and I'll dispense.
Gentlelady accepts it. I want to thank the member for the amendment. Hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment?
Well, Ms. Wilson came in. She left out, I guess, but I'd like to offer her amendment up for the committee.
Or to offer the amendment for Ms. Wilson and in her stead. Is there objection? Chair hears none.
Amendment's
Chair
at the
recognizes you for 5 minutes.
The
Call up your amendment from the desk.
amendment is at the desk.
Our clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 021, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2484, offered by Ms. Wilson of Florida.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. So ordered. And before I recognize the gentlelady, I want to let her know we're going to accept her amendment, so if she would agree to submit her statement, or Mrs. The ranking member in her stead, if she's agreed to submit her statement for the record, we'll move directly to voting on her amendment. Is the gentlelady ready?
I agree to just submit the language to the record and allow Mr. Hall to accept it. Plead with you, as a matter of fact.
Okay, you don't have to do that. It helps, but you don't have to. Hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those who oppose it say no. There are no noes. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Okay, are there any other amendments to the amendment, and for what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
The amendment is offered by Ms. Edwards.
And you stand in her stead. Is there objection? The chair hears none.
Amendment should be at the desk.
All right, the next amendment is offered by the gentlelady from Maryland. Are you ready to proceed? If so, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 016, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2484, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. It's so ordered. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield to Mr. Sarbanes a minute to make his statement on it.
Sarbanes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay, which we've been referring to, and in the tributaries, of course, that flow into the Chesapeake Bay, exist there, and that's where the dissolved oxygen levels drop to levels that are too low to sustain marine life. These are growing at an alarming rate. The one that Mr. Harris referred to before is projected to be perhaps the biggest dead zone we've ever had. The effects of this can be seen in some of the statistics that from the 1950s to the 1970s. Average annual oyster catch was about 25 million pounds per year, and the blue crab harvest contributed nearly a third of the nation's catch. Now that has dropped significantly, so the oyster population is 2% of the historic level, and the reduced amounts of underwater grass habitat in addition to low summer levels of dissolved oxygen, continue to keep the crab population below where it should be. Don Bosch, who's president of the Center for Environmental Science, at the University of Maryland and an expert on these zones said this year's water flow will rank at least among the 5 largest, a result of heavier than normal rains and snowmelt mixed with high amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And that the dead zone is going to cover a third of the bay. That's about 83 miles when last measured. So this report underscores the effect nutrient loading has on the nation's water systems. And there have been efforts to address the source in terms of the agricultural sources for this. So while we must support, obviously, the agricultural sector, we want to be looking at the effect of nutrient loading from these kinds of sources. The amendment that the gentlelady has put forward, Amendment 16, would ensure that that happens. And I would just add that my hope would be going forward, perhaps we could even further amend this, perhaps on the floor, or working with the committee to look at all of the different sources that generate these algal blooms. In addition to agricultural sources, I'm very interested in stormwater runoff from other sources as well, and to have a sense of the comparative source of these different harmful effects on the Chesapeake Bay, I think would be a good result from the kind of study that the task force can do. And with that, I yield back to the gentlelady.
Thank you. And I'd like to yield the remainder of the time to the author who has arrived, Ms. Edwards.
I thank you very much, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Sarbanes, and we share a deep interest in protecting the Chesapeake Bay. Waterways like this, particularly, and the impact of algal blooms on the plant and sea life in the bay and tributaries. And I know that there's much more, actually, that we can do, and this is, I think Mr. Sarbanes has articulated a very limited way in which to tackle a problem that threatens the very life and health of the nation's largest bay in this respect. And so I thank Mr. Sarbanes for standing in my stead. I had a conflict, and I know that there are challenges even on our eastern shore with our farmers and others who we want to enjoy their livelihoods, but we also have the duty to protect waterways like the Chesapeake Bay to ensure that fertilizers and other sources of harmful pollutants don't impact and threaten other kinds of industries that are very dependent on these waterways. And so I think that we're trying to strike a good balance here between what we need in terms of our the economic health of areas like our eastern shore, but also ensuring that waterways like the Bay and in Maryland and other waterways across the country and those tributaries are protected from the harmful effect of algal blooms. And with that, I yield.
The gentlelady yield back, or does she request 5 minutes of her own time as the author?
Out of respect for the committee, it was my fault I was late. So I really do appreciate the time, though.
All right. Gentlelady refuses to offer 5 minutes.
She kindly thanks the chairman.
I was really enjoying listening to her. But, all right. We've discussed the amendment. As you know, we're proceeding under the 5-minute rule. I want to thank the member for the amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does this gentleman request recognition?
To discuss the amendment.
Yields 5 minutes for you, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I clearly understand that nutrient flows are an important issue and do contribute to the growth of harmful algal blooms. That's fairly well accepted. However, numerous other programs already study the impact of nutrient flows and utilize other sources of funding from multiple agencies, including the Department of Agriculture and the EPA. This amendment would conflict with the non-duplication provision included in the bill under the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Duplication of federal programs is a drain on scarce resources. that do come at the expense of the research and technology development needed to directly suppress or eliminate harmful algal blooms. We all know about the GAO report that looked through the government and found numerous areas where multiple federal agencies do what appear to be the same thing. And I think that this amendment would just do that. In addition, the amendment exclusively targets one source of nutrients to the apparent exclusion of all the others. And I'm pleased that the gentleman from Maryland in his comments suggested that perhaps at some point we could introduce an amendment, perhaps before this bill comes to the floor, that might expand that to look at all sources. But I will say that we offered that during discussions of the bill, and that was refused by the author of the amendment. Now, agricultural manure, which is the one item specifically named, actually is not the largest source of nitrogen in the bay. It happens to be municipal wastewater plants. In fact, Blue Plains, the municipal wastewater plant that drains this building, is in fact the largest single point source, accounting for 6 million pounds of nitrogen. And in fact, they had to be taken to court 2 years ago in order to reduce that pollution level. So I would urge that if the committee at some point or the body considers an amendment in this nature, where we begin to duplicate what other agencies have done, if we're going to go ahead and duplicate what other agencies have done, I would urge the action by the body to be that we include all sources, particularly the largest single point source of nitrogen, which are municipal wastewater plants. So, you know, we could have had a more inclusive amendment. I would offer that I'd be willing to support that kind of amendment when this comes to the floor. But as the amendment is currently written, I'm unable to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, North Carolina.
Mr. Miller, North Carolina. Recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I think Ms. Edwards has reconsidered her earlier decision to decline time on this. I yield to Ms. Edwards.
I thank you, Mr. Miller. Look, I just want to, to make sure that all the members of the committee are aware that I live in the metropolitan Washington area. We are nowhere near the Chesapeake Bay. Indeed, the area closest to the Chesapeake Bay is in the district of my colleague, Mr. Harris. And what we recognize in this heavily industrialized and commercialized metropolitan Washington areas that the things that we do here impact on tributaries, like impact on estuaries like the Chesapeake Bay. That is true across the country. And one of the things that we've attempted to do on numerous occasions, and as well as the Environmental Protection Agency, is to look at those nitrogen loads that the gentleman speaks of, and we've received tremendous opposition, frankly, from the other side when the Environmental Protection Agency went through our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. We try to look at these issues, and so I think that what we're trying to accomplish here is to simply acknowledge that in this one respect, and there may be other things, as my other colleague from Maryland suggests, that we can do to look at other nutrients. I think it's really helpful for us to be very focused on something that's having a really tremendous impact on this major estuary, the largest estuary in this great nation. And we have an obligation to do something about that. I would point out that in 2010, environmental activists filed a suit against Purdue Farms on the Eastern Shore, claiming that the manure-laden runoff into the Chesapeake Bay led to further pollution of the waters. The Maryland Department of the Environment found high bacteria levels in ditches draining from the farm property into the Chesapeake tributary. And this isn't just about the Chesapeake Bay. We are talking about other waterways across this country. And so while I share and appreciate the gentleman's concern that we haven't done everything, I would urge all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to acknowledge that where there's an opportunity to do something, then we have an obligation to act.
Would the gentlelady yield for a question?
Sure.
Was our colleague right in saying that some of the research we're talking about is duplicative of research that's already going on?
I don't agree with that at all. I mean, I think that we're not trying at all to duplicate what is going on in the Department of Agriculture. They sit on the task force and they can bring their expertise to the table. I think that that would actually be helpful to us. Thank you, and I'll yield.
Gentlelady yields back the gentleman from North Carolina's time. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Richel from Virginia.
Gentleman from Virginia, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly appreciate the gentlelady offering the amendment, and I share her. I can see the passion, and I share the deep concern over the Chesapeake Bay. It's truly a national treasure. I have the great privilege of representing Virginia's 2nd Congressional District, which includes all the Eastern Shore, Virginia Beach, and a good part of Norfolk and Hampton as well. So this is shoreline that well fits within and defines really the boundary of the Chesapeake Bay in the southeast portion. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Dr. Harris, and rather than go through all the rationale that he presented, as I carefully evaluated the bill, the amendment, and the logic both for and against, I've come to the conclusion that it would indeed be a duplicative effort. And so for that reason, I'll not be supporting the amendment, but I want us to continue to work together as a committee to ensure that that great national treasure is taken care of, and I'll fully support efforts as they go forth to make that happen. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Chair hears none. Hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman? Mr.
Recognize
Chairman?
the gentlelady for what purpose?
I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested under the chair's prior announcements. Proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Are there any other amendments to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
And for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
All right. The next amendment is offered from the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Miller. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment, sir?
I am.
Clerk, report the amendment.
Amendment number 372, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2484, offered by Mr. Miller of North Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, it's so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with everything that has been said today. The members of this committee have said all the right things. Harmful algal blooms and hypoxia are very serious problems affecting our coast, our lakes, our waterways. They are harming our economy. They hurt the tourist economy of Florida when there are beach closures. They hurt the fishing and shellfish industries in the Gulf of Mexico. They are obviously devastating the harvest of the Chesapeake Bay. And in every district, every corner of America, they pose a deadly threat to safe drinking water supplies. So harmful algal blooms and hypoxia are serious issues that really deserve a serious response. But while I have agreed with what people have said, I do not agree with what this bill does. This bill actually cuts the funding to do all the things that this bill requires below the existing levels of funding for 2008. Now this is not an appropriating committee, this is an authorizing committee, but here's how it works. If the appropriating committee is not going to give more than is authorized, and if we cut back what is authorized, usually what is authorized by the authorizing committee, which is what we are for purposes of this bill, the authorizing committee will decide what is the amount that the agency really needs to do the job properly. And then it's not at all unusual for the appropriations committee to appropriate less than that amount, but they never give more than that amount. In fact, that's the ceiling on what will be available. So while saying we're going to require NOAA and EPA to do all these things that I think we all agree ought to be done, we are actually cutting back their ability to do it. And so this bill this amendment is very simple. It takes the authorization up to what it was in 2008 to 2010 and extends that authorization, that level, through 2015. I ask the support for this amendment.
All right, is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from California is recognized.
let's just note that in California we have problems with red tide, and I know all about red tide. I know I've gotten it all over my legs and gotten rashes and things from it when I'm out surfing and such. So, and I know that the implication on fish, because I've seen dead fish due to this very problem that we're talking about. So no one is denying that there is a big problem when we discuss the amendments that have been suggested. If something is duplicative, we can no longer afford duplicative research. And perhaps your amendment, Mr. Miller, exemplifies what this fight about balancing the budget or trying to bring the level of deficit spending down is all about. We cannot afford to do everything that we used to do. The fact is, as we are doing it, it is a $1.5 trillion deficit. So if, yes, this does decrease the level and we're down a bit, that's, if we can't even do that, our currency will eventually collapse, because this exemplifies the spirit of what we got to do. We got to, we call it taking a haircut. We got to have a haircut across the board of everything the federal government's doing, asking our federal employees to do their job more efficiently and more effectively, eliminating it when there are duplications that happen, and in fact, cutting down the level of spending in every one of the programs that we're talking about, if it can be done without causing the program itself not to be able to accomplish its mission. Now, there's no reason for us to think that this type of efficiency effort can't be made in science programs as well as anything else. So I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that this is a very good amendment. I mean, this is a very good proposal that we have before us, but the amendment that we have to this would take away the benefits that we're trying to receive to the overall budget. And so I would oppose the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yield back his time.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman
Yes.
yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks further discussion? Gentlelady from Maryland, recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to yield as much of my time as he would consume to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I think that's a fair thing to do. Gentleman from North Carolina.
We have an arrangement at this end of the dais. Let's be honest with the American people. If we really aren't going to do these things, the things that the bill says we're going to do, let's tell them that honestly. But this bill, as it now stands, and as Mr. Rohrbacher just explained it, is fundamentally dishonest. We're telling the American people we're going to do all the things in this bill, but we're not going to provide the agency the funds that it takes to do it. Now, I understand the argument about trying to make them do with less, but there has not been the first suggestion from the majority on how they'll do that. It's just cutting the funding, requiring them to do more, telling the American people, promising the American people, we're going to do all these things to address harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. We're going to do it, but we're not going to provide the funds necessary to do it. That is fundamentally dishonest. If we're not going to do it, and that will be my next amendment, let's tell the American people the truth. But as it is now, this amendment misleads the American people. This amendment does not tell the truth to the American people.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr. President.
Would you,
Chairman.
gentleman yield for a question?
I do yield.
To which one of them?
I'll take the first shot.
Mr. Rohrbach?
So you're suggesting there's not any efficiencies that we could be making in the federal budget whenever we try to reduce it by a small amount?
You know, Mr. Rohrbacher, I am sure there are. Actually, my experience on this committee is I've spotted several things where the federal government is spending too much. A lot of it had to do with well-connected private contractors, many of whom had great friends on the Republican side of the aisle who protected all those appropriations. Now, if the gentleman from California,
that's a fairly partisan thing to say,
or the gentleman from Georgia knows of a cheaper way for them to do all these things, all that they have been doing and more for less money, then you should step forward and say how that is. But just saying, we're going to promise the American people that all this is going to happen, but we're going to provide a funding level that is less than what we provided before. Would the gentleman agree
that when departments and agencies come to us, they quite often add a little bit to their request so that they will get more money? Isn't this sort of a standard operating procedure with many departments and agencies?
And Mr. Rohrbacher, perhaps you should seek to be on the Appropriations Committee. That may be, but we have not heard anybody from the other side of the aisle, from the majority, say how these savings can be achieved. It is just giving more money, less money than agencies have had to do the same work, actually less work, and tell them, now you've got to do, we're promising the American people we're going to do all this other work. We're promising the American people we really are serious about harmful algal blooms and hypoxia, and the people of Florida. We understand the disruption to your economy of beach closures, to the people of Chesapeake Bay. We understand the harm to your economy from what hypoxia, what dead zones are doing to your harvest. We're telling people who have got drinking water that is being compromised by hypoxia and by harmful algal blooms, saying, we're serious about this, we understand it, we're going to do this stuff, but the truth is the agencies are getting less funding to do more. And not a word, not a suggestion from the majority on how that's going to happen.
The gentleman,
I yield time to Mr. Sarbanes.
All right.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to support the amendment. I think you have to properly resource the function that we're giving to NOAA here. And on the economic argument that was raised, the fact of the matter is that the research that NOAA does is critical to policymakers at the federal level and at the state level and at the local level in terms of making decisions about how to protect and preserve these natural resources that we have. So if you're talking about the Chesapeake Bay, where the economy of a region is heavily dependent on the health of that bay, then making sure that the resources are there so the research can be done, so the policymakers can put in place the kinds of things to protect those natural resources is absolutely fundamental. And if you shortchange that, you're going to have tremendous negative economic consequences for the region at a time when the country is looking for economic recovery. And I yield back to gentlemen.
Reclaiming my time, it is still my time. There has been a hearing on this topic. There was not one word of witness testimony that these programs, the existing programs, were being handled inefficiently. And this amendment does not increase funding; it provides flat funding.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time is
Mr. Chairman.
It's who seeks recognition?
Mr. Harris.
Gentleman from Georgia. No, gentleman from Maryland, who?
Dr. Harris.
Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Leah, let's be honest. Let's look at the actual amount spent, because we have heard that we're reducing this funding below 2008 levels. Now, this is just simple math. Let's add up the authorizations in this bill. It's $20.7 million. The total amount spent on harmful algal blooms in fiscal year 2008 was $18.1. Now, I know I went to school a while ago, and I know that's old math, but 20.7 is more than 18.1. This actually authorizes at a higher level than the actual expenditures in fiscal year 2008 and matches the actual expenditures in fiscal year 2010. Matches, not a dollar less. Now, let me address specifically the comment from the gentleman from North Carolina. I'm not sure he was here for my statement on this amendment in the nature of substitute. The fact is that we cut 10 reports out. Now, I'm just going to repeat it because the gentleman from North Carolina is not paying attention. We cut 10 reports out. That's how we create the efficiencies. Our estimate is that saves $3 million, freeing it up from writing a report to actually doing research. So to the subcommittee chair, the ranking member, rather, of the subcommittee that I chair, I would suggest we will spend more on actual research and not writing reports than we do now. But that's not all. The point from the gentleman in and I'm sorry to the gentleman in California, I'm sorry to disappoint you, and he's left, but we actually spend more. We're actually increasing the amount we spent over fiscal year 2008. Oh, you're there. We don't cut
Don't let Dr. Brown hear it.
We don't cut the total amount spent. I'm afraid the gentleman from Georgia will offer an amendment later to cut even that amount. But we don't spend less. We spend it better. We cut out reports. We eliminate duplication, and we do exactly what the American people have sent us here to do. Recognize a program that's important, maintain the funding, and do it more efficiently. Truly doing more with less. That's what our challenge is. Now, I have 5 kids. They come to me all the time wanting more. Believe me, anybody who has a child knows that. And it's sometimes you have to say, you know, we can't afford it. This is what we can afford. Let's make do with what we have, and let's do it more efficiently, more thoughtfully. Now, furthermore, there has been a suggestion that if these amendments don't pass, this bill shouldn't be passed. I would suggest that's a dangerous strategy in an environment where we are looking to cut trillions of dollars in spending. And remember, the authorization has expired on this program. I suspect that when push comes to shove, folks will look at what hasn't had a reauthorization and simply cut the funding. This reauthorization level funds, not only level funds totally, it's 3.6 million more, I'm sorry, 2.6 million more than fiscal year 2008, and cuts $3 million worth of reports, and furthermore, in statute, ends duplicative work in the federal government. That's what the majority thinks is the way you have to handle budgets and authorizations in this current environment we're in. This is an incredibly important program. My colleagues from Maryland have outlined the importance of this program. Harmful algal blooms are something that we need to continue studying. We need to know why dead zones occur and how to deal with them and how to minimize their effect. I would urge rejection of this amendment and passage of the reauthorization bill. And, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Down here, Mr. Chairman. Congresswoman Woolsey.
Oh, Ms. Woolsey?
Your girlfriend, for heaven's sake.
I can't turn you down.
Well,
Chair recognizes you for 5 minutes and recognizes you for 10 minutes, and 5 minutes is already gone.
There you go. So, Mr. Chairman, I just would like to remind everybody that in order to vote for this bill, many of us want a few absolutes, and Mr. Miller's amendment provides this for us. So think about that. I mean, not that it's going to make a difference if it's the vote is on a right down on a bipartisan down the line, but I mean partisan. We'd like it to be bipartisan, and with that, I would like to yield the rest of my time to Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Ms. Woolsey, for yielding. Again, my information is simply different from what Mr. Harris has just said. My information is that expenditures in this fiscal year for NOAA for this program was 20.7. To get around to play games with cut-go rules that the majority adopted, they have cut the authorization for that to move part of the funding to EPA, but the result is that the amount authorized is less than what has been spent in the recent past. Again, we had a hearing on this. There was not a word about reports, and by eliminating report, we could save $3 million in funding. Not a word to support that argument, and not a word to suggest that what those reports were that are duplicative or unnecessary or whatever else, or that not doing those would save $3 million. This simply appears to be requiring the same agencies to do more work with less money, and telling the American people that we're going to do things that we are not really going to allow federal agencies the resources to get done. It's not honest with the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Hearing no further discussion, request. The vote occurs on the amendment. What does the gentlelady request recognition?
Strike the last word.
Chair recognizes you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all recognize that we are an authorization committee and not an appropriations committee. But we also know that it has a lot of influence in what we authorize. My concern is that when we authorize more activity than what we're willing to authorize the expense to do it, we make the agencies feel that they have failed, and then we really get on the agencies because they have failed if it's not done. My concern is that we are expecting so much more than what we are willing to authorize. Now, we know whatever we authorize, the appropriators are probably going to cut it some. And I'm not suggesting that we over-authorize, but what I am suggesting perhaps is we'll look at the activities that we're requiring, which I believe are very important activities, and recognize that these are human beings that we are authorizing to do this work. And it's just so much you can do if you don't have the people to do it. And if you don't have the funds, you don't have the people to do the work. And so I would just make an appeal to the committee that if we cannot support this amendment, take a look at the next one, so that when it is impossible to do the work, that they simply will report that they cannot do it with that amount of money, and we all will be even. We'll know that from the beginning. But I don't think it's fair to the agencies, nor is it fair to the public, for us to do all this authorization and know that it's very likely the work cannot be done. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. If there is no further discussion, hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Miller, North Carolina, request a recorded vote.
All right, roll call vote's been requested. Under the chair's prior announcement, proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Are there any other amendments to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
And for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The next amendment is offered from the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Miller. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 374, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2484, offered by Mr. Miller of North Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. It's so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that this amendment does not really become necessary. I will withdraw this amendment if the previous amendment passes when the time comes for a recorded vote. This amendment is about just being truthful to the American people, that we are not going to tell them that we're going to do all these important things to address harmful algal blooms and hypoxia when we know perfectly well we aren't giving the agency the resources to do it. I think the ranking member earlier said that this bill authorizes the agency to do more things. No, it requires the agency to do more things, and then doesn't even authorize the funds to do it. This amendment says that if they don't get the funding to do their work, they are going to be relieved of these mandates that they can't possibly get done. Let's be honest with the American people. Let's not tell them we're going to do all kinds of important work and it's all going to be free or next to it. If we really are not willing to provide the resources to get things done, let's tell the American people that, and not tell the American people that, oh yes, we are really serious about harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. We really want to protect the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf Coast and drinking water everywhere. Let's not tell people, the American people, something that is not true. And if we have real ideas on how we can save money, let's, fine to hear it. Let's give that to the Appropriations Committee with those suggestions, but not tell the American people that we can do it, no problem. It's just a matter of the federal government agencies doing their work better, and then when they can't get it done, say, those government employees, they just can't get it done. I hope this amendment does not become necessary, but I think in order to be truthful to the American people, we need to pass this amendment at the very least. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
The sponsor of the bill.
Chair recognizes you for 5 minutes, Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much. I won't take 5 minutes. I won't prolong this, but let's look mechanistically at what this amendment does. This amendment removes our committee's ability to make a statement on how important algal blooms are in hypoxia by saying that if NOAA appropriations are $1 less, then this entire program doesn't have to be done by NOAA. $1. Now let's look at NOAA's appropriations. A big chunk of NOAA's appropriations for a satellite program. In future years, by this kind of amendment, let's say the decision was made the satellite program shouldn't be done, so appropriations are lowered because we don't want to fund a satellite program. We want to change the funding of a large segment of a budget. Then this says, and they don't have to worry about algal blooms. In fact, the committee tells them quite specifically, don't worry about it. You don't have to do any of this. It completely eliminates everything, all the emphasis that we put on harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. So although I appreciate how important the sponsor of the amendment feels this program is, I actually feel this amendment, if you think this program is important, this is a harmful amendment. This tells the agency we don't really want to be prioritized in your budget, because if your funding goes down $1, you don't have to study harmful algal blooms. You can do whatever else you want. It is the prerogative of this committee to spell out in this kind of reauthorizations what we think those agencies should do. And that's why this amendment, although it sounds good on the surface, says, sure, if fundings go down, we should stop mandating things. In fact, in practicality, a $1 decrease, and I'd be willing to, I'll yield to the offer of the amendment if he contests that a $1 decrease in appropriations completely negates the requirements of the bill. So I would urge that we do not adopt this amendment. We need this reauthorization. We are in a very hazardous time for programs here in Washington. You just have to look at the current discussion. Again, we're looking to cut trillions of dollars. We should have to give the clearest signal possible that this is in fact a very important program and not give the ability to an agency who in all likelihood, as other agencies, may have their appropriations cut below current levels, the ability to prioritize. That's our job to prioritize. That's not the job of the departments and agencies. So I would urge a no vote on this amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentle yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just be really quick, and then I yield a minute to my colleague from North Carolina. I represent the headquarters of NOAA, and I think one of the things that happens is that we're telling the people in the state of Maryland and across this country that we're doing something that we're really not going to be able to do because the agency has no money. And I thank the gentleman from Maryland, but I think that he ought to be honest with the people on the eastern shore of Maryland that he's not doing a thing here that's going to protect the Chesapeake Bay that's in his home district from harmful algal blooms because we haven't provided the resources to do it. And I think this is a bit of truth in advertising. We will go and, and just flat fund and slice off the top of an agency and then say to all the good workers at NOAA and the scientists at NOAA, but we still want you to do it anyway. We still want it to be part of your agenda. Well, how about a little truth in advertising, and truth in advertising for the people who live in all of our congressional districts who, on the one hand, because of an agency's mission, expect one thing out of them, but know that they're going to be delivered something far less because this Congress refuses to provide the resources that are necessary for them to do the job. And I want NOAA, I want our agencies to have the resources that they need to protect the Chesapeake Bay. And I would hope that the gentleman from Maryland, whose district is the Chesapeake Bay, would want the agency to have those resources as well. And with that, I yield to my colleague from North Carolina.
Thank you. Ms. Edwards, if we are truly going to cut trillions of dollars, let's tell the American people what that's going to mean. Let's not mislead the American people. Let's not claim that we're going to do all the same things that we've been doing before. There has not been any suggestion from this committee at all about how the work of these agencies in addressing hypoxia, dead zones, harmful algal blooms, how that is going to be done more efficiently. We're just saying, here's less money, good luck. If you get the job done, we'll take credit because we said you had to do it. If you can't get the job done, we're going to blame you. That's pretty much how the majority appears to be working. I think it's pretty cynical. I hope and believe the American people will see through it. But that's where we are right now. Let's be honest with the American people. Let's say if we're not going to provide the funds to the federal government agencies to get their work done, we're not going to tell the American people that we have required all that to happen when it cannot possibly happen. And again, this amendment is flat funding, not increase in funding, to do more work. And it does not say they can't do it if they can do it within that amount of money. It just says they won't be required to do it. So we aren't telling the American people the untruth that we are going to make sure that they get all this stuff done, this important work done, while we are not providing them the resources to do it. I yield back to Ms. Edwards, who I think probably yields back to the chair.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition? Strike the last word.
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I do want to yield my 5 minutes to Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much to my colleague for yielding the time. This is pretty amazing. We've heard the phrase, let's be honest, suggesting that there's dishonesty here. And then, I'm not being truthful in some way with people in my district. Here's the truth. We borrow 41 cents out of every dollar we spend. 41 cents out of every dollar we spend. Our AAA rating will likely become a AA rating. We're having a nation-dividing discussion about how bad our debt and our deficit issue is. And we're having an argument over the amendment about whether level funding is adequate. Level funding is adequate. Wow. I hope the American people are watching. I hope they're watching members asking the body to just go ahead and write the wish list and fund the wish list, and don't worry, your next generation, your children and grandchildren are going to pay for it. And to my colleagues from Maryland, I suggest that before you offer amendments about the Chesapeake Bay, let's start offering amendments about blue plains. Let's start offering amendments about wastewater treatment. We could spend millions and millions of dollars, as we actually have, improving the bay by some of those mechanisms. But I would suggest that the person representing the Chesapeake Bay might have a better idea about how to represent it and what programs are needed, fitting within the context of our budgetary problems. Now, I haven't been down here to vote for those budgets. Some of you may have been down here to vote for those budgets that went way overboard. We were sent here last year. I believe the elections of 2010 were about coming down here, looking at what's an important thing to do in government and funding it. It's exactly what this bill does. And what this amendment says is that if there is now imagine how unrealistic this amendment is. This amendment suggests that we perhaps should fund all the federal agencies at exactly the same level we had this year. Well, that's great, but let's call up China and see if they're still willing to float our bonds, if that's what we're going to do. If that's what this body and this chamber and this government is going to do, let's just call up China and see how big our credit card limit is with them. That budget is full of programs that are important, chock full of programs that are important. We can't possibly increase the funding in all of them. This is what's called discretionary spending, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't a mandatory program, and I would welcome the members from across the aisle to suggest where we go into entitlement programs, the non-discretionary spending, in order to free up money for this. I haven't heard suggestions. So we're left with looking at discretionary spending. I would offer to the committee that level funding a discretionary program, even that's a reach. But we need to make that reach, because this is an important program. And that's been pointed out by every single member offering an amendment to this, is how important this program is. It's important enough that in the midst of a huge fiscal crisis, this committee has decided to take up its time to reauthorize a program at existing levels. Now, I know that's not trendy in Washington to just level fund, because actually we all know that in Washington speak, a cut in funding is a decrease in the increase. America knows we can't play that game anymore. The game being played is the game of let's shame someone into agreeing to spend a whole lot of money and make a whole lot of promises we know we can't keep. The promises we know we can't keep have been made. They total up to $14.2 trillion. Those are the promises we can't keep. If we had accept in the final vote the prior amendment of the offer of this amendment, we would be making a promise to the American people we know we can't keep. We can't possibly increase the funding for necessary programs by over 50% because we're already borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar. But what I really don't like and really find objectionable is language like, let's be honest, or suggesting that a member is not truthful. I'm sorry, maybe I was just raised differently. But I find that very intriguing. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. If there's no further discussion on the amendment, Chair recognizes the gentlelady
Strike the last.
from Texas. Strike the last word. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to yield my time to Ms. Edwards.
Thank you. And I want to be very brief because I want to point out another truth, and it is that there's an average of $82 million in damage each year due to the harmful impacts of harmful algal blooms. And we spend on the order of $20 to $25 million a year. I don't think that sounds like savings, and I would point out to all of us on the committee that we are, even in the process in this Congress, debating an interior appropriations bill that doesn't allow us to deal with things like stormwater runoff and protecting our groundwater because we've slashed and burned those budgets too. And so I would point out to the gentleman and my colleague from Maryland and to all of us that what we're trying to do here is to make sure that if we are giving an agency a mission, that we are reasonable in terms of what we indicate they require to fulfill that mission. Otherwise, let's not give them the mission, and let's be truthful about the resources that it takes to do the job, and that's what this amendment seeks. And with that, I yield.
All right. Gentlelady yield back.
I yield back the balance of the time. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Hearing no further discussion, a vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The chair.
Mr. Chairman.
No, ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair, who seeks recognition?
Mr. Miller, North Carolina.
Mr. North Carolina.
Request a recorded vote.
Go ahead and state your question.
Request a recorded vote.
All right. A requested vote has been call for. Under the chair's prior announcement, proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Pursuant to the chair's earlier announcement, and to ensure members have notice of the time, further proceedings on the postponed questions will resume within 5 minutes. Committee stands in recess. The committee will come to order, and pursuant to the chair's earlier announcement and ensure members have notice of the time, further proceedings on the postponed questions will resume at 1 p.m. We are in recess until 1 p.m. All right, the committee will come to order. Are there any other amendments to the amendment? Hearing none, the unfinished business of the committee is the postponed roll call on the amendment offered by Mrs. Edwards. Edwards Amendment number 016 to the Harris Amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall.
No.
Chairman Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Smith.
No.
Thank you. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mrs. Adams. Mrs. Adams votes no. Mr. Quayle. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel votes no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Corbett. Mr. Corbett votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Benishek. Mr. Benishek votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Costello. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Fudge. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell votes aye. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark votes aye.
Are there other members who wish to vote? Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Lucas votes no.
Mr. Chairman, Holtgren from Illinois.
Mr. Holcomb.
Yes, Holtgren votes no.
Mr. Holcomb votes no.
Are there others?
Mr. Costello votes aye.
Are there others? Okay. Are you ready to call a roll? All right. The clerk will call a roll. Excuse me. All right. Hold up on that request to call in a roll. We'll ask if all members voted. Do any members wish to change their vote? All right. Ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. Chairman, 14 members vote aye and 18 members vote no.
On this vote, there were 18 noes, 14 ayes. Amendments not agreed to. All right. Are there any other amendments? Wait a minute. Just a second. The unfinished business committee is a postponed roll call on the amendment offered by Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller's amendment number 372 to the Harris Amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall.
No.
Chairman Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Brown votes no. Mrs. Adams. Mrs. Adams votes no. Mr. Quayle. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel votes no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Korvac. Mr. Korvac votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Benishek. Mr. Benishek votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Fudge. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell votes aye. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark votes aye.
Are there other members who wish to vote? Have all members voted? Do any members want to change their vote? All right, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 14 members vote aye and 18 members vote no.
All right, the amendment is not agreed to. All right, this is where we are. All right, the unfinished business of the committee is the postponed roll call on the amendments offered by Mr. Miller. Miller Amendment number 374 to the Harris Amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall.
No.
Chairman Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mrs. Adams. Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Quayle. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel votes no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Korvac. Mr. Korvac votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Benishek. Mr. Benishek votes no. Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Costello? Mr. Costello votes aye. Ms. Woolsey? Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Mr. Wu? Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Giffords? Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Clark? Mr. Clark votes aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 13 members vote aye and 19 members vote no.
All right, the amendment is not agreed to.
Do you have 18?
All right, the questions on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Dr. Harris as amended. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Miller?
Mr. Chairman, I have request to record a vote.
All right. Roll call vote's been requested. Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall?
Aye.
Chairman Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Roybacher? Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett? Mr. Bartlett votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken? Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. McCall? Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes aye. Mrs. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Quayle? Mr. Quayle votes aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman votes aye. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel votes aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris votes aye. Mr. Haltgren? Mr. Haltgren votes aye. Mr. Kravac? Mr. Kravac votes aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Benishek? Mr. Benishek votes aye. Ms. Johnson?
No.
Ms. Johnson votes no. Mr. Costello? Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Woolsey? Ms. Woolsey votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Wu? Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords? Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Mr. Clark? Mr. Clark votes no.
Are there other members who wish to vote? Are there other members who wish to change their vote? All right, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 20 members vote aye and 15 members vote no.
All right, the amendment is agreed to. Question now occurs on adopting the bill, H.R. 2484, as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill as amended is agreed to. Who seeks recognition? Mrs. Johnson seeks recognition. For what purpose, Ms. Johnson? All right, record vote's been requested. Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall. Chairman Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mrs. Adams. Mrs. Adams votes aye. Mr. Quayle. Mr. Quayle votes aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes aye. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel votes aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo votes aye. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris votes aye. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Holtgren votes aye. Mr. Kravac. Mr. Kravac votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Benishek. Mr. Benishek votes aye. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson votes no. Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark votes no.
Are there other members who wish to vote? Are there any members who want to change their vote? All right, clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 20 members vote aye and 15 members vote no.
Mr. Chairman?
On that vote, there were 20 ayes and 15 noes. Bill is agreed to. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I was detained, and had I been present, I would have voted aye on Ms. Edwards and both of Mr. Miller's amendments, and I would ask that the record be noted to reflect that, and thank the gentleman for his courtesy.
It will be noted. Is there objection? Chair hears none. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Harris, to offer a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 2484 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that the staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration.
Questions on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion reconsider is laid on the table. Now we're ready to go. All right, members may have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. This concludes our full committee markup. Chairman now declares the full committee adjourned.